The old instructor stood at the edge of the parade ground, his weathered hand reaching for the cane that wasn't there. His fingers closed on empty air. The recruits watched from formation, stifling smirks, waiting to see the 70-year-old man fumble and struggle without his support. They'd hidden it as a prank, thinking they'd finally get a rise out of the silent veteran in the red jacket, who never raised his voice, never demanded respect, just shuffled through each day with that same sad, serious expression. They had no idea what they were about to witness. His name was Thomas Brennan, though most of the recruits just called him the old man behind his back. He'd been instructing at the training facility for 3 years now, ever since his wife passed, and the silence of his empty house became unbearable. The facility director had offered him the position out of respect for his service, though nobody at the base seemed to know exactly what that service entailed. Thomas never spoke about it. He showed up each morning in his red jacket, over a faded t-shirt, white hair, and white beard neatly trimmed, that perpetually sad and serious expression fixed on his weathered face. He used a cane to get around, his gait slow and deliberate, and the younger instructors often wondered why someone so clearly past his prime was still teaching at all. The recruits in his charge were a mixed group, mostly young men and women fresh out of high school, cocky and eager to prove themselves. They'd grown increasingly bold over the weeks, testing boundaries, whispering during instruction, rolling their eyes when Thomas turned his back. He never reprimanded them, never raised his voice. Just continued in his quiet, patient way, demonstrating techniques with careful precision, speaking in that soft tone that barely carried across the training yard. Some recruits thought he was weak. Others thought he was just too old to care anymore. None of them understood that his silence wasn't weakness, but the discipline of a man who had nothing left to prove. The morning of the inspection had started like any other. Thomas arrived before dawn, as he always did, and set his cane beside the equipment locker while he prepared the day's training materials. That's when Private Marcus Webb, the loudest and most arrogant of the group, saw his opportunity. He'd been complaining for weeks that Thomas was holding them back, that they needed a real instructor, someone who could actually demonstrate combat techniques instead of just talking about them. When he spotted the cane leaning against the locker, he grabbed it and passed it to another recruit who hid it in the supply shed. They gathered in formation, anticipating the show, certain that without his cane, the old man would have to call off the inspection, or worse, embarrass himself trying to conduct it. Colonel Sarah Mitchell was scheduled to arrive at 0800 for the quarterly inspection. She was known throughout the military education system as a no-nonsense officer who demanded excellence and had little patience for excuses. The recruits had been preparing for weeks, knowing that her evaluation would determine whether they advanced to the next phase of training. As they stood in formation, they watched Thomas emerge from the equipment building, his hand reaching for the cane that should have been there. They saw him pause, his expression unchanging, that same sad and serious look on his face. He glanced at the empty space where the cane had been, then at the recruits in formation. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Thomas stepped forward, without the cane. His gait was different now, not the shuffle they'd grown accustomed to, but something else entirely. He walked with a precision that made several recruits straighten unconsciously. His posture had changed. The slight hunch they'd always noticed was gone, replaced by a bearing that spoke of decades of discipline. He moved down the line of recruits, his sad eyes taking in every detail, every imperfect crease in their uniforms, every scuffed boot. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The weight of his gaze was enough to make Private Webb shift uncomfortably. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke the silence. Colonel Mitchell's staff car pulled up to the parade ground, and she emerged in her crisp uniform, medals catching the morning sun. She was a woman in her 50s, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression all business. She approached the formation with purposeful strides, then stopped dead when she saw Thomas standing at attention before his recruits. Her face went completely white. Her hand came up in an instinctive salute that she held rigidly, her eyes locked on the old man in the red jacket. Thomas returned the salute with a precision that made every recruit's attempt look clumsy by comparison. The colonel lowered her hand slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the parade ground with a tremor the recruits had never heard from any superior officer. She said his name differently than anyone at the facility had ever said it. Not Thomas, not Brennan. She said, "Sergeant Major," and the words hung in the air like a physical presence. She said, "I didn't know you were here." She said, "These recruits have no idea who's been training them." Private Webb felt his stomach drop. Sergeant Major was a rank that commanded instant respect, the highest enlisted position in the military, a rank earned through decades of exemplary service, but the colonel wasn't finished. She turned to face the recruits, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something close to anger. She told them that the man they'd been dismissing as too old, too slow, too quiet, was Thomas Brennan. She told them that Sergeant Major Brennan had served for 38 years. She told them he'd been deployed to every major conflict of his generation. She told them he'd received the Medal of Honor for actions in a firefight where he'd held a position alone for 6 hours, against overwhelming force, saving his entire platoon. The recruits stood frozen. The colonel continued, her voice rising. She told them about the Silver Star he'd earned for rescuing wounded soldiers under heavy fire. She told them about the 3 Purple Hearts, the Bronze Stars, the commendations that filled an entire wall in the military archives. She told them that he'd trained some of the most elite soldiers in the armed forces, that officers twice their rank would consider it an honor just to shake his hand. And then she told them about the injury that had ended his active service, the one that shattered his hip and left him with chronic pain, the one that made him use a cane, not because he needed it to stand, but because without it, every step was agony he chose to endure in silence. Private Webb's face had gone from cocky to ashen. He thought about the cane, hidden in the supply shed, and the sick realization of what they'd done washed over him. They'd taken away the one thing that gave this man relief from constant pain, thinking it would be funny to watch him struggle. They'd mocked a genuine hero because he didn't fit their image of what strength looked like. The colonel's eyes swept the formation, and she asked a question that cut through them like a blade. She asked if any of them had seen the sergeant major's cane. She asked because she'd noticed he was standing without it, and she knew what that meant. The silence stretched. Then Private Webb broke formation. He ran to the supply shed, his movements jerky with shame, and returned with the cane. He approached Thomas with his head down, holding it out with both hands like an offering. His voice cracked when he tried to apologize. Thomas took the cane without a word, his sad and serious expression unchanged, but he didn't lean on it. Not yet. He turned to the colonel and spoke for the first time, his soft voice somehow carrying more authority than any shouted command. He told her that these recruits were learning, that they were young, that mistakes were part of the process. He said it with such quiet dignity that several of the younger soldiers felt tears burning in their eyes. Colonel Mitchell's expression softened slightly, but she wasn't finished. She told the recruits that they would complete the inspection, but afterward they would spend the remainder of the day learning about the man who'd been patiently teaching them. She said that Sergeant Major Brennan's service record would be required reading. She said that they would write essays on what true strength meant. She said that respect wasn't given based on appearance or age, but earned through character and sacrifice, and the man standing before them had earned more respect than they could possibly comprehend. The inspection proceeded in absolute silence. Every recruit performed flawlessly, driven by a desperate need to prove they were worthy of the instruction they'd been receiving. Thomas moved through the ranks, still without using the cane. His movements careful, but steady. When he finally did lean on it, several recruits noticed the slight grimace he couldn't quite hide, the tension in his jaw that spoke of pain he'd been managing all along. They understood then that every day he'd shown up early. Every patient explanation, every careful demonstration had been performed while dealing with discomfort they couldn't imagine. After the inspection, the colonel gathered the recruits in the classroom. She pulled up Thomas's service record on the screen, and for the next 2 hours she walked them through a career that read like a history of modern warfare. She showed them commendations signed by generals and presidents. She showed them photos of a younger Thomas standing with units that had become legendary. She showed them the citation for his Medal of Honor, reading aloud the description of how he'd held a strategic position despite being wounded, how he'd called in artillery on his own location because it was the only way to stop the enemy advance, how he'd survived against impossible odds through sheer will and tactical brilliance. Private Webb sat in the front row, unable to look away from the screen, unable to process how badly he'd misjudged the quiet man in the red jacket. The colonel showed them footage from a ceremony where Thomas had been promoted to sergeant major, where officers had lined up to shake his hand, where the commanding general had called him the finest soldier he'd ever known. She showed them letters from soldiers whose lives he'd saved, from officers whose careers he'd shaped, from families who owed their loved one's survival to his actions. And through it all, she emphasized that he'd never spoken about any of it, never demanded recognition, never used his reputation to command respect he could have claimed at any moment. When the presentation ended, Colonel made them understand something crucial. She told them that the military wasn't just about physical strength or tactical knowledge. It was about character. It was about showing up every day and doing your duty regardless of how you felt, regardless of pain or hardship, or whether anyone noticed. It was about serving something larger than yourself with quiet dignity. And Thomas Brennan, she said, embodied those values more completely than anyone she'd ever served with. The fact that he'd continued teaching despite his pain, despite being dismissed and disrespected by recruits who should have been honored to learn from him, proved that his dedication hadn't dimmed after nearly 4 decades of service. In the days that followed, the training yard transformed. The recruits arrived earlier, stood straighter, listened with an intensity they'd never shown before. When Thomas spoke in his soft voice, they leaned in to catch every word. When he demonstrated a technique, they watched with reverence, understanding now that every movement was informed by real experience, by situations where the difference between correct and incorrect execution meant life or death. Private Webb requested a private meeting with Thomas, where he offered a formal apology that went beyond the hasty words he'd stammered on the parade ground. Thomas accepted it with the same quiet grace he showed everything, telling the young man that recognizing mistakes and learning from them was what separated good soldiers from great ones. The facility director, learning what had transpired, offered to reassign Thomas to a less physically demanding role, perhaps administrative work that wouldn't require him to be on his feet all day. Thomas declined. He said the recruits needed him, and more importantly, he needed them. Teaching gave him purpose. It connected him to the service that had defined his life. The pain was manageable, he said, and besides, he'd endured far worse for far less important reasons. The director didn't push. He understood that some men were built to serve, and taking that away would hurt Thomas more than any physical injury ever could. Colonel Mitchell made it a point to visit the facility regularly after that day. She'd served under Thomas early in her career, during a deployment she rarely spoke about, and he'd been the one who taught her that leadership wasn't about authority, but about earning trust through consistent action. She told the recruits this during one visit, explaining that the officer she'd become was directly shaped by the lessons Thomas had taught her 20 years ago. She said that his influence extended through generations of soldiers, that his legacy wasn't in the medals or commendations, but in the countless lives he touched and improved through patient, dedicated instruction. The recruits began to notice things they'd missed before. The way Thomas positioned himself during demonstrations to minimize strain on his injured hip, the careful stretches he performed before training sessions, the momentary pause he took before standing from a seated position, gathering himself against the pain. These weren't signs of weakness, but of determination, of a man who refused to let physical limitations prevent him from fulfilling his duty. They started arriving early to help set up equipment, reducing the physical demands on him while learning additional skills in the process. They asked questions about his service, not nosily but respectfully, and sometimes Thomas would share a story, always framed as a lesson rather than a boast. Private Webb became one of Thomas's most dedicated students. The shame of his prank had transformed into fierce determination to honor the man he'd disrespected. He studied Thomas's methods, asked for extra instruction, and began to embody the quiet professionalism that Thomas exemplified. By the end of the training cycle, Webb had transformed from the loudest recruit to one of the most focused, and when he graduated at the top of his class, he asked Thomas to present his certificate. Thomas did so with a handshake and a rare smile, the sadness in his eyes lifting briefly to reveal pride in what the young man had become. The story of what happened that morning on the parade ground spread through the military education system. Other instructors began sharing it as a lesson about assumptions and respect. The facility started including Thomas's service record in orientation materials for new recruits, ensuring they understood from day one who was teaching them. But Thomas himself never changed. He still arrived before dawn in his red jacket and t-shirt, still moved with that careful gait, still spoke in that soft voice. The only difference was that now, when he walked across the parade ground, recruits stood at attention without being told. When he entered a room, conversation stopped, not from fear, but from respect. The kind of respect that can't be demanded, only earned through a lifetime of service and sacrifice. On the anniversary of that inspection, the recruits who'd been present organized a ceremony. They presented Thomas with a photograph of their graduating class, every member standing at perfect attention, with an inscription thanking him for teaching them what it truly meant to serve. Thomas accepted it with his characteristic quiet dignity, his sad and serious expression softening just slightly. He told them that they'd taught him something too, that their transformation had reminded him why he'd chosen to keep serving, despite everything. He said that watching them grow from careless kids into dedicated soldiers had given him more satisfaction than any medal or commendation ever could. The cane remained a symbol, but its meaning had changed. It wasn't a sign of weakness, but a reminder that strength takes many forms. That enduring pain to fulfill your duty is its own kind of courage. That the quietest voices sometimes carry the most important messages. The recruits learned to look beyond appearances, to recognize that the unassuming old man in the worn red jacket possessed more knowledge, more experience, more genuine strength than they might accumulate in a lifetime. They learned that respect isn't about rank or youth or physical prowess, but about character demonstrated through consistent, selfless action. Thomas Brennan continued teaching for several more years, shaping hundreds of soldiers who carried his lessons with them throughout their careers. Some of them would face combat, and in those moments they'd remember the quiet man who taught them that true strength isn't loud or showy, it's patient, it's persistent, it endures. And when Thomas finally did retire, it was to a ceremony attended by officers and enlisted personnel from across the military, all of them gathered to honor a man who'd spent nearly half a century serving his country with unwavering dedication. The 70-something veteran in the red jacket stood before them, leaning on his cane, that same sad and serious expression on his weathered face, and accepted their gratitude with the same quiet grace he'd shown everything else in his remarkable life.